Okay, hello economics students. This dot point is all about how we measure this magical 3 to 3.5% growth in real GDP figure. Firstly, there are a couple of ways we can think about GDP. And the first way we can think about that is what we call nominal GDP. And this measures the total amount of production in terms of value. So, the value of all the stuff that we produced in an economy over a period of time. Now, to go a little step further, the value is really just measured by taking the price of things and timesing it by the amount of things sold or the quantity or volume, and that gives us the total value. So, if we added up all the school fees, the value of school fees, the value of Slurpees and coffees, and the total value of bananas and clothes and everything else that was sold in an economy over a certain period, that would give us nominal GDP. And therefore, from there, we can look at growth in nominal GDP. So if we added it all up and it equaled $2 trillion, which is roughly what the Australian economy produces, and it increased from that period to the next, from say 2 trillion to 2.1, well, we can calculate the growth in this data as well. So that would be a 10% growth rate in nominal GDP. Now, you might already be thinking this sort of price times volume, this nominal GDP is not the measurement for strong and sustainable economic growth. It's not our target because what we need is real GDP. So nominal GDP is close to telling us what we need, but there's a problem. What we really need to measure in order to understand have we grown the economy in a way that will create jobs is have we increased the volume or the quantity of goods and services. Okay, we need to know have we produced more stuff, and nominal GDP doesn't quite tell us that because measuring value or nominal GDP actually will include the impact of price increases, which is misleading. So, for example, if I used a silly example here, if we had an economy that produced 100, let's call it coffees, and they sold them for $5, well, the nominal GDP in that economy would be equal to $500, right? That's the nominal GDP in the first period. In the next period, if they sold 100 coffees again, but the price went up to $5.50, well, if we were just measuring nominal GDP, we'd say this economy has increased its nominal GDP from 500 to 550. Now, if you didn't know that this about the impacts of inflation, you'd say that that's an improvement in material living standards. But that's not the case, is it? Because all that happened is the prices went up and the volume actually stayed the same. It went from 100 to 100. So we need to find a way to remove the impacts of price and get a better measure of living standards in an economy. So what do? Well, what we do is we remove the effects of inflation, and that gives us what is called real GDP. And there's no guesses for why it's called real. Now, you don't need to know how to calculate real GDP, how to remove the impacts of inflation from nominal GDP. But if you wanted to, you could Google chain volume or a chain volume GDP or the price deflator, and that will tell you how it actually happens. We don't need to know that in VCE Economics. But from now on, whenever you see real GDP, you just want to assume that this is the total volume of production because what has happened is they've taken the value and they've removed the price impacts. So, real GDP is looked at in a similar fashion to nominal GDP. It's just that inflation's removed and it's telling us volume. I said that a couple of times. Real GDP can be quoted in value terms. So we can look at it in terms of an increase in real GDP from 2 trillion to 2.1 trillion. Again, that $2 trillion has had inflation taken out of it. Or we can look at it in growth terms. So what happened to the growth over a period of time, or what happened to GDP over a period of time in terms of its rate of change. Okay, so remember the goal for strong and sustainable growth is we want to see real GDP growth of 3 to 3.5%. In this economy here, it's grown by 5%, so growth is too strong. Okay, finally putting this all together, on this graph we've got, it hasn't been labeled very well and I apologize for that, but I rushed it in Excel. The blue bars are the value of real GDP or the volume, remember the value taken out in prices, and on the left hand side that tells us the value of production in real terms on the left-hand axis here. The orange line shows us the growth rate in real GDP, and you can see that whenever there's an increase in one of these bars, that results in a growth rate above 0. Okay, this dotted orange line here is our growth rate, and the growth rate is on the right-hand side of this graph. Over COVID, we had a big drop in GDP. You can see here it was about 520 billion. It went all the way down to 480, and that's going to result in a negative growth rate. So if we look over here on the right-hand side, it was negative 7% growth in real GDP. All right, hopefully that's helped you to understand a real GDP and how we measure strong and sustainable growth. Bye for now.